Natalie sat at the head of the conference table, her eyes scanning the financial reports in front of her. The hum of conversation around her faded as she felt the familiar buzz of her phone in her pocket. Glancing at the screen, she saw Daniel's name flashing across it. She hesitated. It wasn't unusual for her husband to call during the day, but something about this moment felt off. Maybe it was the way their last few conversations had been laced with an edge of detachment, or how lately he always seemed to be in a rush to hang up. Steeling herself, she excused herself from the meeting and stepped out into the hallway, pressing the phone to her ear. "Hey," she greeted, expecting the usual pleasantries. "How's your day? When are you coming home?" But the voice that answered wasn't warm or familiar. It was clipped, smug, and eerily detached. "I'm divorcing you," Daniel said. For a moment, the words didn't register. It was as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he continued, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I've already sold the penthouse, so you'll need to figure out where you're going to live." Natalie's grip on the phone tightened. The audacity of it. The complete lack of remorse. He was speaking as if she were an inconvenience, a minor obstacle in his new, carefully constructed future. She forced herself to stay calm, though her heart pounded violently in her chest. "You sold the penthouse?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his tone casual, almost condescending. "Emily and I need the money to set up our life together. She deserves better than that place anyway." Emily. The name stung. It confirmed what Natalie had suspected for months: the late nights, the sudden work trips, the growing distance between them. She had tried to push the thoughts aside, convincing herself she was imagining things. Now, here was Daniel, saying her name so effortlessly, as if Natalie were the intruder in his life, not the woman he had vowed to love. A fire ignited in her chest, but she refused to let him hear it. Instead, she inhaled deeply, keeping her voice measured. "Sounds good," she replied evenly. There was a pause, as if Daniel had expected something else: shock, anger, pleading. But he had underestimated her. For the next few moments, she barely heard the rest of his words. The reality of the situation sank in. 6 years of marriage discarded over the phone with all the grace of a business transaction. He had already moved on, built a new life, made financial decisions as if she didn't exist. He thought he had won. What he didn't know was that the penthouse was still hers, and he was about to find that out the hard way. Natalie stood frozen in the empty hallway of her office, the weight of Daniel's betrayal pressing down on her like a stone. The smugness in his voice replayed in her mind, each word laced with a kind of arrogance that made her stomach turn. He had truly believed he could erase her from their life together with a single phone call. Just like that, as if 6 years of marriage, of sacrifices, of building a future together meant nothing. The sheer audacity of it left her breathless. But more than the affair, more than the cold, calculated way he had delivered the news, it was the sale of the penthouse that rattled her most. That home had been everything to her: a milestone, a sanctuary, a symbol of what she had worked so hard to achieve. And yet, Daniel had tossed it away without hesitation, as if it were just another asset to liquidate. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, and forced herself to think clearly. Hadn't there been signs? The growing distance between them, the dismissive way he brushed off her concerns, his sudden interest in last-minute business trips. She had tried to believe it was just a rough patch, something they could work through. But now, standing in the cold light of reality, she saw it for what it was: a slow unraveling, one she had been too blind or too hopeful to acknowledge. Then something clicked. The sale? How could he have sold the penthouse without her approval? She had been meticulous about their finances, especially when they refinanced months ago to secure better rates. Her eyes widened as she remembered a crucial detail. The deed had been transferred into her name alone. Daniel had barely skimmed the paperwork, signing it without question when she explained it would make the process smoother. He had no idea. A slow, steady heat spread through her. Not anger, but something sharper. Satisfaction. He thought he had played her, thought he had stripped everything away, leaving her scrambling, but in his arrogance, he had made a fatal mistake. Natalie straightened her shoulders, the shock dissolving into resolve. He didn't own the penthouse. She did. And by the time he realized it, it would be too late. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the one person who could turn this betrayal into the beginning of his downfall. Olivia, she said as soon as her lawyer picked up, I need your help, and trust me, you're going to love this. Natalie sat on the edge of the hotel bed, her phone pressed to her ear as Olivia's sharp, no-nonsense voice came through the line. Let me get this straight, Olivia said, disbelief evident in her tone. Daniel sold the penthouse that he doesn't even own? That's right, Natalie replied, pacing the room, her heartbeat steady now, her mind clear. He thinks he got rid of me. He thinks I have nowhere to go. But he never checked the deed. The property is legally mine. A brief silence followed, then Olivia let out a dry chuckle. Oh, this is good. This is really good. The amusement in her friend's voice sent a thrill of satisfaction through Natalie's chest. For the first time since Daniel's call, she felt powerful. Not blindsided, not weak, but in control. She had always thought of Daniel as sharp, clever in a ruthless way, but the truth was, he had never truly paid attention to details. He had coasted through life, assuming he was the smartest person in the room, confident that no one would challenge him and that carelessness was about to cost him everything. What's our next step? Natalie asked, gripping the phone tighter. We'll start by notifying the buyer that the sale is invalid, Olivia said. Once they realize they've been duped, they'll turn on him fast. If he's already taken any money from them, he could be in serious legal trouble. Fraud, misrepresentation, breach of contract, you name it. A rush of satisfaction filled Natalie. Let Daniel deal with the consequences of his own arrogance. He had expected her to crumble, to be left homeless and helpless. Instead, she was about to pull the ground out from under him. I'll also send him a formal legal notice, Olivia continued. We'll make it clear that the sale is void and that if he doesn't back off, we'll escalate. He thinks he's in control, but he's about to get a reality check. Natalie exhaled slowly, feeling the first real sense of calm since this had all begun. Good. Do it. Then she made her own decision. She wasn't going to wait around for Daniel to realize his mistake. She was going home. She booked the first flight back, ignoring the growing list of missed calls and texts from Daniel that began to flood her phone. He must have sensed that something was wrong. Good, let him worry. As the plane took off, she stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the darkening sky. She had spent years thinking Daniel was her equal, her partner. Now she saw the truth. He was nothing more than a coward, a man who built his life on lies and expected others to clean up the mess. Well, not this time. By the time she landed, she would be ready. Natalie stepped into the penthouse, closing the door behind her with a quiet finality. The place was exactly as she had left it. Daniel's expensive suits still hanging neatly in the closet, his favorite whiskey bottle sitting on the marble counter, as if he still believed he owned everything here. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't his home anymore. It never had been. She didn't have to wait long. That evening, just as Olivia had predicted, Daniel stormed through the front door, his face red with anger, a crumpled legal notice clutched in his fist. What the hell is this? He barked, waving the paper in front of her. Natalie leaned against the kitchen island, her expression calm. That would be your official notification that the sale of this apartment is void. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. It turns out you can't sell something you don't own. Daniel's face twisted in confusion. That's not possible. I signed the paperwork. I made the deal. She held up a single sheet of paper, the deed to the penthouse, her name clearly printed on it. The apartment has been in my name for months. You signed off on it when we refinanced, remember? She smiled, her tone light, as if explaining something to a child. You didn't read the fine print, did you? For the first time since his smug phone call, Daniel hesitated. His eyes darted over the document in her hands, realization dawning like a slow, painful burn. That's impossible, he muttered, more to himself than to her. You're lying. She let out a soft laugh. I think we both know I'm not. Daniel's grip tightened around the paper in his hand, his entire posture shifting from confusion to rage. You think you're so smart, don't you? He spat. You really think this changes anything? I already made a deal. You're going to look like a fool when this all falls apart. Natalie took a step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make him listen. The sale is already void, Daniel. The buyer knows it, and they're not happy. They're considering legal action against you for misrepresentation and fraud. The word fraud sent a visible shiver through him. Her gaze remained steady. And if you've already taken any of their money, well, let's just say you'll be dealing with more than just a divorce lawyer. Daniel's confidence cracked. Just a little. He glanced at his phone, likely thinking about the unread messages from the buyer, the deal that was already slipping through his fingers. This is ridiculous, he muttered, pacing the room. You're blowing everything out of proportion. You can't just kick me out. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Actually, I can. She gestured around them. This place, it's mine. Legally. You can stay for now, but only because I'm giving you the courtesy of time to figure out where you're going next. But make no mistake, Daniel, I'm not the one leaving. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Natalie turned away, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace settle in her chest. She had expected rage, expected heartbreak. Instead, all she felt was freedom. This was her home, and no one, not even Daniel, was going to take it away from her again. The next afternoon, just as Natalie was settling into the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming her space, the front door swung open without warning. Daniel walked in, and this time he wasn't alone. A woman followed closely behind him, tall, elegant, and unmistakably self-assured. Emily. Natalie didn't flinch. She had been expecting this. Emily took in the penthouse with an approving glance, her fingers trailing over the sleek furniture as if already imagining where she would put her things. Wow, she mused, looping her arm through Daniel's. This is even nicer than I imagined. Natalie folded her arms, amusement flickering in her eyes. Oh, you imagine living here. Emily turned to her, her perfectly glossed lips curling into a smile that barely concealed her condescension. Well, I mean, Daniel told me this place was ours now. It's just a matter of finalizing the move. Daniel remained silent, his jaw clenched. He already knew what was coming. Natalie didn't bother hiding her smirk. She stepped forward, meeting Emily's gaze head on. I hate to break it to you, but Daniel didn't tell you the full story. She let the moment stretch, enjoying the flicker of uncertainty in Emily's expression before she continued. He never owned this penthouse. It's legally mine. Has been for months. Emily blinked, the first crack in her perfect composure appearing. That's not possible, she said, looking at Daniel for confirmation. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. It's complicated, he muttered. Not really, Natalie said, tilting her head. Daniel tried to sell an apartment that wasn't his to sell. That means there is no sale, no money, no fancy new beginning for the two of you. She let her gaze settle on Emily, watching as her confidence gave way to disbelief and then anger. Emily took a step back, her grip tightening around her purse. Wait, she said, her voice sharp. You told me this was your place, that you sold it and we were starting fresh. Did you lie about that too? Daniel's silence was deafening. Natalie leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, just enough for the words to sting. Looks like you weren't the only one being played. Emily's expression hardened, and without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. Daniel watched her go, his posture tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides. His carefully built fantasy had crumbled right in front of him, and for the first time, he was the one left behind. The moment the door slammed behind Emily, a heavy silence settled over the penthouse. Daniel stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the door and Natalie. For the first time, he looked truly lost. His confidence had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who had gambled everything and lost spectacularly. Natalie watched him carefully, waiting for the inevitable next move. "You think this is funny?" He finally snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. "You think you've won?" Natalie sighed, more exhausted than angry now. "Daniel, this isn't a game," she said simply. "This is just reality finally catching up with you." She turned away, walking toward the kitchen, completely unbothered by his tantrum. She had spent years walking on eggshells around his moods, trying to keep the peace. Not anymore. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You're not going to get away with this." Natalie paused mid-step and glanced over her shoulder. "Get away with what?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Keeping what's legally mine? Refusing to be manipulated? Watching your little fantasy life fall apart because of your own arrogance?" She shrugged. "That's not me getting away with anything. That's just karma." He exhaled sharply, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "Oh, it absolutely is." Natalie walked over to the entryway, picked up a sealed envelope from the table, and dropped it onto the counter in front of him. "That's the divorce paperwork. Olivia's already handled everything, so all you have to do is sign." "The sooner you do, the sooner you can move on." Daniel's face darkened. "You're really just kicking me out like that?" Natalie exhaled, shaking her head. "No, Daniel, you kicked yourself out the moment you made that phone call. The moment you thought you could sell our home out from under me, that was your choice." She crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. "Now, you're just dealing with the consequences." For once, he had no response. His shoulders slumped slightly, his anger giving way to something dangerously close to regret. But it was too late for that. Natalie turned away, giving him the time he needed to process reality. She didn't need to watch him stew. She had more important things to focus on, like finally reclaiming her life. As Daniel finally stormed out, slamming the door behind him, a strange sense of lightness filled the room. The penthouse felt different now, cleaner, freer. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past 6 years finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, Natalie felt like she could breathe again. In the days that followed Daniel's departure, Natalie wasted no time reclaiming her space. The penthouse, once a reminder of a life built on illusions, was now a blank canvas waiting to be transformed. She spent an entire weekend boxing up Daniel's leftover belongings, making sure every trace of him was removed. The expensive suits, the overpriced whiskey collection, the gaudy decor he insisted on keeping, all of it was packed away, ready to be sent to whatever hotel or rental he was now sulking in. With each item she removed, the air felt lighter, the apartment brighter. Tessa, her best friend, arrived one evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. "You know, I always hated that ugly coffee table," she said, nudging it with her foot. It screamed midlife crisis. Natalie laughed, shaking her head. "I hated it too, but I let him have his way with so many things just to avoid an argument." "Well," Tessa grinned, raising her glass, "here's to never doing that again." They toasted, the clinking of glasses echoing through the now Daniel-free home. For the first time in years, Natalie didn't feel like she was living under someone else's rules. This space was hers now, and she intended to fill it with things that made her happy. She spent the following week rearranging furniture, swapping out cold, impersonal pieces for warm, inviting ones. It wasn't just about redecorating, it was about reclaiming every inch of her life. The penthouse no longer felt like a relic of a failed marriage, but rather a sanctuary, a place that finally reflected who she was. Despite multiple missed calls and desperate texts from Daniel, ranging from half hearted apologies to attempts at guilt tripping her, she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. One afternoon, Olivia called with an update. The divorce is moving along smoothly, no roadblocks. Once he signs, you'll be officially free. Free. The words settled deep in her chest, filling her with a quiet, steady sense of peace. This wasn't just about leaving a marriage, it was about stepping into a future where she called the shots. And after years of being overshadowed, manipulated, and dismissed, Natalie was finally ready to embrace it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. A month later, Natalie found herself at a rooftop restaurant, the city skyline stretching out before her, glittering against the night sky. Everything had changed. The penthouse, once a battleground, had become a space of peace. The divorce, now finalized, was nothing more than paperwork confirming what she had already known. She was free. Sitting across from her, Olivia swirled her wine glass, a satisfied smirk on her lips. So, Olivia said, raising her glass, to fresh starts and well-deserved victories. Natalie clinked her glass against hers, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Not just from the wine, but from the quiet contentment of knowing she had won. Not just against Daniel, but against every moment of doubt, every instance where she had convinced herself to stay silent, to compromise, to settle. You played the long game without even realizing it, Olivia added, amusement in her tone. Honestly, it's kind of poetic. Daniel spent years thinking he was always one step ahead, and in the end, he was the one who walked straight into his own trap. Natalie laughed, shaking her head. He was so sure I'd be helpless without him. He never even considered that I might have been paying attention all along. Olivia leaned forward, eyes gleaming. And now? Natalie exhaled slowly, looking out at the view, the city humming with life beneath them. Now, I finally get to do things on my own terms, she smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. No more waiting for someone else to make decisions. No more living in someone else's shadow. As the night wore on, they reminisced, laughed, and planned for the future. A future Natalie was finally excited about. When she returned to the penthouse later that night, she stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like 1,000 possibilities stretching out before her. She thought back to the phone call that had started it all. Daniel's smug voice, the certainty in his tone when he thought he had won. He had been so wrong. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the beginning of something better. A life where she was in control, where she made the rules. For the first time in a long time, Natalie felt truly, undeniably free. Oof! Natalie's story is a powerful reminder that self-worth, resilience, and preparation are the keys to overcoming betrayal. At first, she was blindsided by Daniel's arrogance and deceit, but instead of breaking down, she took control. The biggest lesson here is that knowledge is power. Because she had been careful with her finances and aware of the details, she was able to turn the situation around. It teaches us that paying attention, even in relationships, is crucial, as deception often hides in the small details. Another takeaway is that self-respect is non-negotiable. Natalie didn't beg, plead, or let Daniel's manipulation control her emotions. Instead, she stood firm, proving that true strength isn't about fighting back with anger, but with intelligence and confidence. This story also highlights that revenge isn't always about getting even, it's about moving forward. Natalie didn't waste time dwelling on what was lost. She focused on rebuilding and reclaiming her life, showing that the best way to win is to thrive. Ultimately, this story teaches us that no matter how devastating betrayal may seem, it can be the catalyst for something better, a fresh start, a stronger mindset, and a life lived entirely on your own terms.